everybody. I'm Diane Brady. I'm here with Matthias Matthijs, who is a senior fellow for Europe at the Council on Foreign Relations. He's also an associate professor at Johns Hopkins in the School for Advanced International Studies. Good to see you, Matthias.
Good to see you, Diane.
So we are talking about this move toward the far right. We've obviously been seeing it for quite some time, most recently with the elections in the Netherlands with Geert Wilders. Can you tell us more about that? And then we'll move on to this gathering that took place in Florence over the weekend as well. How significant was this election?
Yeah, the Dutch election was a bit of a surprise result because you've kind of had a very stable situation in the Netherlands. 23 years, two prime ministers, one kind of mild-mannered Christian Democrat who was very centrist, called Jan-Peter Balkenende, and then, of course, Mark Rutte, who was a liberal, but, progressive, but centrist, who had been there for 13 years, 4 cabinets. And so the Party for Freedom, the party of Geert Wilders, had been doing well occasionally, right? In 2010, they did very well, about 15%, and then again 7 years later or so. But, nobody really expected him to kind of get to where he did, 23.5%, which in a perfectly proportional system, leads to 37 seats and gives them kind of the initiative to form a government. He never got anywhere close to that. I think what happened is that this was an election fought on migration, on immigration, on asylum seekers, on refugees, and so on, all these things muddled together. And also the outgoing Rutte government, his successor, insisted on fighting the election on this program, had also opened the door to governing with him, but never expecting to have to govern with him as prime minister, right? More having to have his support for a government or something like this, which I think in the last week gave a lot of voters hope that if they voted Wilders, he would actually be in charge, would actually govern. And that kind of saw this surge in just the last week and this kind of shock victory.
What's interesting, especially an American audience is used to the two-party system. And so when you say almost one quarter, obviously this is a coalition government that he will have to form. Let me just, before we get into his platform, note that the party that came second seems to be on the opposite end of the spectrum. I don't know if that's fair to say, but does that basically just point to growing extremism? Because that party got 25 seats. It was very much about climate. It was about rights for migrants and such. Talk a little bit about what it says about the state of Dutch society. Yeah,
so unlike in the United States, where every opinion poll, whether it's Biden versus Trump or it's Republican versus Democrat, they're incredibly close together, right? I mean, there's some states where they're further apart, but in general, the population as a whole is fairly close. In the Netherlands, the left is very small. It's maybe 40 seats of the 150, right? So it gets to maybe 30%, which means 70% is center-right to far-right. So the party of Frans Timmermans, who had united the Greens and the Social Democrats, actually managed to cobble together something like, 20% of the vote. And then there's two more other left-wing parties that are less significant. Then that adds up to that. So everybody was expecting a center-right government, maybe with the support of the far-right, but probably not. In this case, you're going to end up with a much more right-wing government, because that seems to be how the people have voted. The three biggest center-right and right-wing parties all had platforms based on limiting immigration into the Netherlands.
Well, and it's not just immigration, because I know that he's very much been characterized as anti-Islam. Is that fair? I mean, from what I've read, it's banning mosques, banning the Quran. That sounds very problematic, to say the least.
Oh, absolutely. It's unconstitutional in the Netherlands, right? But it's how he got the attention as this kind of firebrand, anti-Islam, anti-migrant. But you're absolutely right? I mean, banning mosques, getting rid of Qurans because they're supposedly incompatible with Dutch society is a non-starter for any other of his coalition partners. And he knows it, right? And Geert Wilders already during the campaign had said things like, well, we don't have to have a referendum on leaving the EU like he's still campaigning on. We don't have to talk about closing down mosques. These things can be put on the back burner or in the freezer. He said in the Dutch equivalent. So that's one thing. And immediately after the election, a few days later, he was quick to point out, like, listen, we're a party for all Dutch citizens, whether they're Christian, whether they're Muslim, or whether they non-believers. And so that's, I think, the first time he's ever said this, right? But it's also part of, I think, the appeal that he got in the election a few weeks ago was really that even the media had started calling him, instead of Wilders, they call him Milders. Like, he'd become milder in his rhetoric and also vis-a-vis
moving toward the center.
Exactly.
So because I think that's an interesting point to make when we've looked at other coalition governments that have been formed in Europe, led by the far right. They've certainly had to, neutralize or perhaps compromise might be the right term on some of their rhetoric. So give us some sense of what we should make of this swing to the far right. Is it being exaggerated in your mind, or is it a very real threat to Europe, especially since we've seen this gathering in Florence over the weekend?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's exaggerated in the sense that it's real, right? I mean, a lot of people, I think, kind of naively believed that with the pandemic, this would go away. Why? Because, the last thing you want in a public health crisis is to have amateurs in charge, right? You want serious people with expertise and so on, right? And I remember during the Brexit debate, the idea was people have had enough of experts telling us what to think, right? And so, of course, that was never going to be the case, right? So here they are. There's real appeal. But I'd say there's two different strands of right-wing populism in Europe, right? There's the strand that we saw with Orban, in that we still see Orban in Hungary and his Fidesz party. We saw it in Poland with Kaczynski's PIS party. These have an authoritarian bent, right? So they're hell-bent on limiting media freedom. They want to seize the judiciary, plant their judges in there, and basically reform the whole democratic system. That only works if you're a one-party government, right? With some sort of majoritarian system, meaning 40% of the vote gets you 60% of the seats. In many ways, the way the UK system works. Meloni, another example of a right-wing politician, the Italian prime minister who's in charge of a right-wing coalition, they immediately have to compromise with other parties, right? She governs with Forza Italia, the old party of Silvio Berlusconi. They're sort of more center-right, and immediately some of her wilder ideas, whenever it comes to challenging the European Union or the EU's authority on fiscal affairs, then quickly have to go. So my expectation in the Netherlands would be if, and I do say if, Wilders manages to cobble together a government, he will have to compromise a lot on many things, especially when they come to the European Union.
If he does not cobble together a government, does that mean another election?
No, that's actually never happened in the Netherlands. So what happens if he fails? So he, and I mean, not himself right now. So right now there's somebody who's exploring the options, right? An explorer. They call him, he's a social democrat, but sympathetic to a right-wing government. So he'll explore a kind of government between the center-right liberals, the new party of Peter Omtzigt, the former Christian Democrat, who's also closer on the sort of center-right, and then the citizen farmer movement, plus Wilders' party. They would have a very comfortable majority of I think 89 of the 150
seats. So something will turn out.
Yeah. If that's not possible, the baton will be handed to the second largest party, in this case, the left, right? The Greens and the Social Democrats candidate, Frans Timmermans, the former commissioner for climate, and then he will try to put together a coalition. If that doesn't work, I mean, then eventually you run out of options, and then you would have to call new elections, but we're not there yet.
It's interesting that anti-immigrant also goes with anti-hardline stance, I suppose, on climate issues. I mean, that seems to be the two dominant issues right now. Let me, before I move on, clarify. When you talk about those two strands of far right, the authoritarian versus, I guess, the more democratic in some ways, is that authoritarian streak very much in sort of the former countries of the Eastern Bloc? under the Soviet Union?
I mean,
you mentioned two cases that were.
Yeah, that's where we've seen it thus far, right? I mean, there was a bit of an authoritarian streak at the worst days of Boris Johnson, you could say, right, where he wanted to ignore court rulings when it came to Brexit and things like that, which got a lot of people very anxious in the UK, but it got nowhere near to some of the things that Donald Trump was thinking about in the United States, for example. But you could see someone like Marine Le Pen in France. It's not clear what kind of authoritarian, what kind of right-wing government she would lead, right? She does have elements of both. That said, I think in more mature, more longer established democracies, it's harder, right? So it's not surprising that Orban and Kaczynski were successful in Hungary and Poland respectively, because these countries are relatively young democracies, right, from the early 1990s. So they have a kind of good, at the time of Orban coming to power, it was like a 20-year tradition, right? Of course, similar with Putin in Russia, right? I mean, he came to power after a 10-year experiment with democracy under Boris Yeltsin. So I think the shorter these experiments are, the more likely this authoritarian streak becomes.
You know, you mentioned Boris Johnson, and when you go to Britain, there seems to be, if not regret, certainly a lot of existential angst over having left the EU. Does that serve as any sort of cautionary tale when people are talking about a similar move away from the European Union? Or give us some context around how the far right is talking about Europe. You mentioned the term Eurosceptic, for example.
So Wilders is interesting in this sense because he's one of the few populists in Europe left who are openly calling for a referendum to leave the European Union. And in the Netherlands, that's even more shocking in the sense that the Dutch are a founding member of the EU, they're members of the Euro, they're members of Schengen. I mean, it's unimaginable for a country that is a globalization success, right? I mean, they are 90% of what they produce is being exported, 90% of what they consume is being imported. So it is very much an interdependent country and economy. Most right-wing populists, whether it's Orban, whether it's Marine Le Pen, whether it's Matteo Salvini in Italy, they've moved away from calling for a referendum on leaving the European Union exactly because your point that the experience of the Brits with leaving the EU has been a very painful one. And I think most neutral observers would say that it's been, the UK shooting itself in the foot, and that most of the damage has been on the UK side and not on the EU side, which has simply moved on. So what do the populists want when it comes to Europe? They want to reform it from within. They want a very different Europe. They want a Europe that gives much more authority back to member states, right? Whether it's over fiscal affairs, whether it's over immigration, whether it's over values and things like that. So that's where the battle has shifted in many ways over the last few years, last 10 years. Not whether to leave Europe, but what kind of Europe do we want going forward?
Let me ask, I know a lot of the talk is about Muslim, Islam, fundamentalists. We've had major geopolitical conflicts over the past year. Let's start with Ukraine. Obviously, how has that impacted the political landscape in terms of what we're talking about here?
Yeah, so I think Ukraine, especially coming right after the COVID pandemic, had the effect of uniting Europe, at least initially, right? I mean, we can talk about where the war is today and whether there's still the same sort of resolve on the part of Europe and the West in general to keep this war effort on the side of Ukraine going. But I think it's made the EU at least much more aware of its vulnerability and of the fact that it had to become more autonomous as an actor, right, when it came to the broader geopolitical, geoeconomic field. But it's also, I mean, that's where, again, you see the rift a little bit. And it's interesting, on the far right, you have a lot of Putin admirers, right? I mean, Orban is one. Fico in Slovakia is another, even though he's a social democrat, supposedly, but also with authoritarian leanings. But someone like Wilders is quite sympathetic to Putin, right? As was Matteo Salvini and even Giorgia Meloni. It's only in Italy, when they started campaigning and when it became clear they were going to form a government, they immediately switched tack on this, right? They became very pro-Ukraine war effort and skeptical of what Putin is trying to achieve. My sense is that's going to be the same story for Wilders, right? Is he's going to have to compromise, if he wants to govern, the other parties will say, okay, you're not touching Ukraine, right? or aid for Ukraine. That's a non-negotiable. Similarly with membership of the European Union.
Let me ask about the second conflict that comes to mind, which is the Israel-Hamas war. And you've certainly seen a lot of pro-Palestine protests here. I've certainly heard about them in Europe. Has that created more sympathy at all for the Muslim populations? We certainly hear about a rise in anti-Semitism, so I'm not clear what the picture is like.
The picture when it comes to Israel, Gaza, and Hamas is much more complicated. Right? First and foremost, you have Germany. Germany is a unique case, given its history, that they are very, at least officially, the government is very pro-Israel. Right? I mean, they are even going as far as to say that Muslims should openly call out, and openly every single Muslim should speak out against anti-Semitism, which, is going quite far. I mean, most Muslims are not constantly thinking about these sorts of things, right? Then there's France, where there's a very big Jewish population and a very big Muslim population, right? And where President Macron has to walk a very thin line of like, how much do you support Israel's right to defend itself versus the proportionality that this war then questions, right? So it's tricky because it seems like the left-wing parties that are in government and have to take an official line that is more balanced are struggling with their Muslim voters, right? And it's the left-wing parties that are in opposition that have a much easier time to criticize Israel's efforts, right? It's different in Europe from the United States, I think. In general, is that the official line in Europe has always been much more pro-Palestinian, right? Or even-handed, whatever you want to say. But we've always seen the side of the Palestinians, and it's much better reported on and much better explained in Europe. So it makes for a very difficult conflict. And as you've seen, when it comes to Ukraine, it's been quite easy for Europe to remain united. When it came to Israel, Gaza, it's been hard from the beginning for Europe to speak with one voice. Do we continue giving aid to the Palestinians or not, was the question. What do we do to the West Bank but not Gaza? What about Hamas? Some countries did not want to recognize that Hamas was a terrorized group. Others then said, well, that's the EU official line. So it's much harder there. And again, it does worry me because it seems like it's inviting extremism on both sides, especially, again, as we saw in Paris last weekend,
right,
on the Muslim fundamentalist terrorist side.
To close the loop, let's go back to this meeting in Florence or anything else that's on your radar. This was a gathering of far-right leaders hosted by the Deputy Prime Minister, far-right leader. What should we make of this? Is this a concern that they're getting together, or is it just natural that political allies would meet ahead of the European Parliament elections next year?
Yeah, so they've always existed, these kind of larger European families and the way they sit together in the European Parliament. And what I think has always bedeviled the far right or the right in Europe, once you move away from kind of conservatives or Christian democratic centrists, is that they're hopelessly divided, right? Not only are there two factions, so there's one, the European reformers, the ECR, and then there's the identity, kind of much more heavily based on national identity grouping. And then, of course, there's Orban that doesn't have a family right now. He used to be part of the European People's Party, but then was kicked out. And so if all those groups would get together and form one group, they would be formidable, right? They would be like close to 1/3 of the votes and of the members of parliament, and may even be the biggest group. The problem is they don't agree, as you would expect, right? Because in the end, they're all about more national sovereignty, and they are not natural partners in a European integration project. That said, given what we've seen in the Netherlands, and even in the Polish elections, which were in the end a good result for non-far-right parties, the far right was still the largest party there, right? So you could see in the run-up to the elections to the European Parliament, which will be held in early June 2024, these are what political scientists call second-order elections. What do I mean by second-order elections? It's like the midterms in the United States. Not that many people vote, not that many people pay attention, and it's the perfect time to protest, right? To kind of show you're unhappy with your current government. And so who do you vote for then? Usually for the far right, right? And so they tend to do much better in European Parliament elections than they would in national elections, number one. But this time, really, because immigration is the kind of the thing that binds all these parties, and people are much more aware of the European dimension, the European border dimension, it's a real fear that they will do a lot better than expected, in a way that even Wilders in the Netherlands far outperformed his opinion polls, right, and ended up with a much stronger result. That would then complicate coalition formation, a new commission coming in at the European level next summer.
A lot of trends to keep our eyes on, and thank you very much, Matthias, for helping us to make sense of all of it, and I look forward to continuing the conversation.
You're welcome, Diane. Thank you very much for having me.